For two officers on the prowl, they were the perfect target, an elderly couple, alone on a quiet country road. No witnesses, no one to call for help. They thought their authority was absolute, their intimidation untouchable in the broad daylight. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They didn't just pull over a vintage car, they pulled over the parents of a United States Marine, and when that gunnery sergeant stepped out of his truck, the balance of power didn't just shift, it shattered into a million pieces. What happened next would draw the eyes of the entire town, turning a roadside stop into a public trial on the scorching asphalt. Before we get into the story, I have to ask, in your town, in your state, who holds the powerful accountable? Let me know in the comments. If you believe stories like this are essential, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Share this video because you never know who needs to see that they are not alone. The sun was a warm, liquid thing, dripping honey gold through the dense canopy of oak and pine that lined the two-lane country highway. It painted the long, polished hood of the 1972 Buick Electra in a light that felt like a blessing, turning the deep burgundy paint into the color of fine wine. Inside the car, the air was thick with the resonant voice of Mahalia Jackson pouring from the single dashboard speaker, a river of sound that washed over the comfortable silence between the two occupants. On the driver's side, Walter Peterson's hands rested on the wide, thin arc of the steering wheel. They were not the hands of a man accustomed to leisure. They were maps of a life spent in labor, each knuckle a thick knot of cartilage, the palms broad and cross-hatched with lines of faded white against his dark skin. These were the hands that had framed houses, fixed engines, and held his wife's own for 50 years of Sundays. The leather of the wheel was worn to a dark, smooth patina precisely where his thumbs rested, molded by decade after decade of his steady, patient grip. He drove the car not with the tense focus of a younger man, but with the relaxed intimacy of a seasoned rider on a familiar horse, the Buick an extension of his own will. Eleanor, beside him, shifted in the plush passenger seat, the worn fabric soft against her cotton dress. She looked out at the passing trees, a green and amber blur. The road stretched on, straight and quiet, swallowed by the forest on either side. A flicker of unease, as faint as a moth's wing, brushed against her. "Are you sure this road is the best way, Wally?" she asked, her voice soft, carrying easily over the music. "It feels a little empty out here." Walter's gaze remained on the road, but a low, warm rumble started in his chest. He reached over with his right hand, the one not steering them through their life, and gave the padded dashboard two fond pats, a gesture of reassurance for both the car and his wife. "It's the scenic route, L," he answered. 50 years. We've earned a bit of scenery." He glanced at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a silent smile that she had known since they were 19. "Besides," he added, turning his attention back to the asphalt ribbon unwinding before them, "the Buick likes the open road. No one to bother us." The words settled in the warm air, and Eleanor's faint unease dissolved. It was their anniversary week, a half-century since they'd stood in a small, crowded church and promised each other a lifetime. This Sunday drive, like so many before it, was their private celebration, a quiet ritual of shared peace. Mahalia's voice swelled, and Walter began to hum along, his baritone a familiar counterpoint to the Queen of Gospel's powerful alto. He had a surprisingly good voice, one she usually only heard in church. The memory of their first apartment surfaced, unbidden and welcome, a cramped third-floor walk-up with a window that looked out onto a brick wall. She had bought a single, glorious sunflower from a street vendor and put it in a glass milk bottle on their small kitchen table, its bright face a defiant splash of sunshine in the gloom. It had felt like the most extravagant thing in the world. Now, surrounded by the polished wood grain and chrome of the Buick, a car they'd bought with cash after 15 years of saving, the memory felt both distant and immediate, lost in the music and the motion. Her fingers began to trace the intricate, swirling pattern stitched into the seat fabric. The threads were worn smooth in places, a testament to the countless journeys the car had chronicled. This was not merely a vehicle, it was a rolling archive of their life together. It had carried a nervous, expectant Michael home from the hospital, wrapped in a blue blanket. It had been filled with the chaotic laughter of their grandchildren on trips to the beach, their small, sandy feet leaving prints on the floor mats. It had also been the silent, solemn vessel that drove them home from her mother's funeral. The silence then, a heavy, suffocating thing, so different from the peaceful quiet of today. Their drive was more than a trip. It was a testament to a love that had weathered every kind of storm, some sent by God and some sent by men. A comfortable quiet fell again as the song ended, replaced by the low thrum of the engine and the whisper of wind. It was Walter who broke it, a soft rumble from his stomach that was more felt than heard. Eleanor glanced at him, a knowing smile touching her lips. Just then, her eyes caught a shape up ahead, nestled in a clearing on the right side of the road. A low building, and in front of it, a hand-painted wooden sign, its letters weathered and peeling. The Corner Cup, hot coffee, homemade pie. It looked unassuming, cozy, a perfect pause. "How about a coffee break?" she suggested in pointing. "Look, there's that little diner Michael was talking about." Walter's eyes followed her finger. A slow grin spread across his face, the thought of a sweet treat chasing away the last vestiges of a long drive. "I've been wanting to try their apple pie for ages," he said, his voice full of ready agreement. The premise of pie was all the motivation he needed. With a decisive nod, his hand moved from the steering wheel to the indicator stalk. The distinct, rhythmic tick-tock of the turn signal filled the cabin, a sound marking the end of one journey and the beginning of a brief, promising interlude. He began to ease the Buick off the main road, its wide front grille turning toward the diner's gravel parking lot. The rhythmic click of the turn signal was the only sound for a moment, a tiny metronome counting down to their brief respite. The big car handled the transition from smooth asphalt to loose gravel with a heavy, confident grace, the tires crunching softly. Walter guided the Buick into a spacious parking spot under the shade of a large oak tree, the engine rumbling into silence with a soft sigh. The air that drifted through the open windows was immediately different, no longer just the scent of pine and dust, but now rich with the heady aroma of freshly brewed coffee and frying bacon. It was a smell that promised simple, honest satisfaction. Walter helped Eleanor out of the car, his hand gentle on her elbow, and together they walked towards the entrance. A few wooden tables with large, faded red umbrellas dotted the small patio area, basking in the warm sunshine. They chose one near a planter box overflowing with bright red geraniums. It was the perfect pause in their perfect day, a moment of simple contentment before the world decided to intrude. They had barely settled into their chairs, the warm wood of the table a comforting presence under their hands, when the peace was violently torn. A white police cruiser, stark against the rustic setting, lurched into the gravel lot. It didn't slow so much as skid to a halt, its tires spitting a cloud of gray dust and pebbles aggressively behind their Buick. The fine grit billowed over their table, settling as a thin, unwelcome film on their water glasses. The sound was a grinding roar that scraped away the gentle ambiance, silencing the distant highway hum and the soft clink of cutlery from inside the diner. The cruiser's doors were thrust open in near unison. Two officers emerged. The first, the driver, was a tall young man with a shaved head and a hard set to his jaw that seemed to be a permanent fixture. The second was a woman, her expression unreadable, a pair of dark sunglasses perched on top of her tightly bound hair. Their movements were clipped and purposeful as they walked directly towards the outdoor tables, their heavy boots crunching on the gravel with an unnerving cadence. They offered no greeting, no nod of acknowledgement to the other patrons or the diner itself. Their focus was a laser beam, fixed solely on the elderly couple. As the taller male officer closed the distance, his right hand fell to his side, draping casually but unmistakably over the butt of his holstered service weapon. It was not a direct threat, but a silent, potent declaration of authority, an establishment of control before a single word had been exchanged. Walter's eyes caught the gesture, a small, dark detail in the bright sunshine, and the pleasant warmth of the afternoon began to feel like a chill on his skin. The air, once sweet with the promise of coffee and pie, now crackled. It was a humming, electric tension that seemed to emanate from the two uniformed figures. The world shrank to the small space between their table and the approaching officers. The sunshine no longer felt like a gentle blessing, but a harsh, interrogating spotlight. Their perfect moment of contentment, so carefully earned and savored, was not merely shattered, it was eviscerated, replaced by a familiar, metallic taste of apprehension. Walter felt his shoulders tense, a defensive posture he had learned long ago and had hoped he would one day forget. He saw the faint, happy smile vanish from Eleanor's face, replaced by a tightened look around her eyes, a silent bracing for impact. The officers stopped a few feet from their table, their shadows falling long and dark over them. In the sudden, heavy silence, as Walter met the young man's cold, unwavering gaze, a single, sharp shard of thought pierced through his confusion, a prayer born of a lifetime of weary experience. "Lord, not today. Please, not on our day." His eyes darted to Eleanor, and in her gaze he saw his own fear reflected back, a silent, mutual understanding that their peaceful Sunday was over. The shared glance between Walter and Eleanor lasted only a second, but it contained a full, silent conversation of shared history, of mutual fear, and of a grim, shared resolve. The silence stretched, pulled taut by the officer's unmoving presence. The taller officer broke it, not with a word, but with a deliberate, slow turn of his head. His gaze left Walter's face, traveled across the 20 feet of gravel to the shaded spot where the Buick sat, gleaming and proud. He scanned it from the chrome of its front bumper to the elegant curve of its rear fender, a slow, appraising inventory, as if measuring its worth not in dollars, but in suspicion. Then, his eyes returned to Walter, cold and flat. "This is a whole lot of car," the officer said, his voice an even, disinterested monotone that was somehow more unnerving than open hostility. A real classic, the word, on their surface, could have been a compliment from an admirer. But there was no admiration in the officer's posture, no warmth in his gaze. It was a statement of fact that carried the weight of an accusation. A knot tightened deep in Walter's gut, a familiar feeling he had carried since boyhood. He had learned long ago to distinguish the tone of genuine appreciation from the tone of pointed inquiry. This was the latter. He said nothing, simply held the young man's gaze, his back straight, refusing to be the first to break eye contact. The unasked question was as loud as a siren in the quiet afternoon. "How does a man like you come to own a car like this?" Walter knew that any answer he gave would be the wrong one. His silence was his only shield, seeing he would get no reaction. The officer shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a subtle movement of impatience. His tone shed its thin veneer of detached observation and became colder, more direct. "Is this your vehicle, sir?" The "sir" was a pellet of ice, a required formality, devoid of all respect. Walter forced a slow, steady breath into his lungs before answering. "Yes, officer, it is." His voice was level, but it cost him a considerable effort to keep it from trembling. He would not give them the satisfaction of hearing his fear. He pushed back, gently but firmly. "Is there a problem?" The male officer completely ignored the question, a power play that rendered Walter's query invisible. Instead, the female officer, who had been standing silently a pace behind her partner, took a half-step forward. Her movement drew their attention, a classic tactic of shifting focus. Her voice was as flat and devoid of emotion as his had been. "The license plate on this vehicle doesn't match the vehicle description in our system," she stated as if reading a weather report. Eleanor let out a soft, sharp gasp, a sound almost too quiet to hear, and her hand, which had been resting on the table, clenched into a tight fist in her lap. The female officer's eyes, no longer hidden by the sunglasses now perched on her head, scanned their faces, lingering for a moment on Eleanor's distress before moving back to Walter. "Things get mixed up," she said, her slight pause before the words mixed up, deliberate, designed to let the implication fester. "Cars change hands. You'd be surprised what turns up." The insinuation was no longer unspoken. It was laid bare on the table between them, as ugly and unwelcome as the dust on their water glasses. This wasn't about a clerical error. Walter could see it now with perfect, painful clarity. This was a story they had arrived with, a narrative they were determined to prove. They were not investigating a discrepancy, they were confirming a prejudice. "Ma'am, I can assure you there has been no mixing up," Walter said, his voice gaining a slight edge of indignation. The helplessness of the situation was beginning to curdle into anger. The male officer stepped forward again, reasserting his dominance. "We're going to need to see some identification and proof of ownership for the vehicle." It was no longer a question or an observation. It was a command. "Proof of ownership?" Walter repeated, his voice rising slightly in disbelief. Eleanor's hand flew to her chest, her eyes wide with alarm. "Officer, we've owned that car for over 20 years. We bought it brand new for our 35th anniversary." He was giving them context, history, a truth he hoped could penetrate their wall of suspicion. He was offering them the story of their life, and they were handing him back a criminal complaint. He reached for his wallet, his movements slow and deliberate, while Eleanor fumbled in her handbag for her own. He could feel the eyes of the other patrons on them, their curiosity turning to a more focused, concerned attention. He extracted his driver's license, its edges worn and soft from years in his pocket, and handed it to the officer. Eleanor did the same. The officer took them without a word, his eyes flicking from the plastic cards to their faces, as if searching for a discrepancy there as well. "The registration for the vehicle," the officer said, his voice flat, demanding. A wave of cold dread washed over Walter. In their excitement for the anniversary drive, in the simple, domestic rhythm of their lives, such a thing had been the furthest from his mind. "The registration, it's not on us, officer," he admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He felt a flush of frustration and anger at his own innocent oversight, knowing how it would be perceived. "It's at home, in a safe, with our other important papers." The taller officer stared at him for a long, silent moment. Then, a short, sharp, ugly sound escaped his lips. It was not a laugh but a scoff, a bark of derisive triumph. He looked from Walter to his partner, a smirk twisting the corner of his mouth, as if to say, "See, I told you so." He turned his gaze back to Walter, the smirk firmly in place. His voice was laced with a thick, insulting layer of mock sympathy. "Convenient," the word, a single, dismissive projectile, hung in the tense silence. It invalidated everything. Their 50 years of marriage, their decades of hard work, their peaceful Sunday, their very identities. In that one word, Walter was no longer a husband, a father, a grandfather, or a law-abiding citizen. He was just a suspect whose predictable excuse had just confirmed his guilt. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating, but beneath it, deep in his chest, a spark of pure, hot anger began to ignite. The single word, convenient, echoed in the space between them, sharp and poisonous. For a heartbeat, the anger that had ignited in Walter's chest threatened to flare into a retort. His jaw tightened, and his hands, resting on the table, curled slightly. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend the simple, honest truth of his life against this casual venom. The taller officer saw the spark of defiance in the old man's eyes, a flicker of resistance he seemed to have been waiting for. It was all the justification he needed. With a look of predatory satisfaction, the officer took one deliberate, slow step forward, closing the distance between them, effectively pinning Walter in place with his physical presence. His shadow fell completely over Walter, blotting out the warm Sunday sun. The officer leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a low, menacing command that was meant for Walter alone. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stand up and step away from the table." "Sonam." The proximity was an assault in itself. Walter could smell the faint, acrid scent of cheap coffee on the man's breath. Before Walter could even process the command, the officer delivered the escalated charge, his voice still low but now hard as steel. "We have reason to believe this vehicle is stolen." The accusation, now spoken aloud, was a physical blow. The air rushed from Walter's lungs. Stolen. The word was absurd, a monstrous fiction dropped into the reality of his life. The Buick wasn't just a car, it was 20 years of Sunday services, of trips to visit a newborn Michael at college, of quiet drives with his wife. It was a part of their family, an extension of their home. The sheer, bald-faced injustice of the claim sent a hot, dizzying wave of fury through him. He pushed his chair back, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the patio stones, his body tense, ready to rise and meet this lie with the full force of his 75 years of integrity. But before he could, Eleanor's hand shot out like a dart, her small, cool fingers wrapping around his forearm with surprising strength. Her nails dug into his skin, a sharp, urgent pressure. "Walter, no," she whispered, her voice a strained, desperate hiss. He turned to look at her, to see her face pale, her eyes wide with a fear that was older and deeper than his anger. "Don't, Wally. Just let them. Please. It's not worth it." Her plea was a torrent of shared memory, a reminder of other times, other places where a black man's righteous anger was twisted into a justification for violence. Her eyes said what her words could not. "We know how this goes." The female officer, who had been watching the silent, tense exchange with an unnerving stillness, chose that moment to intervene. Her voice cut through Eleanor's whisper, sharp and cold as breaking glass. "Ma'am, please remain silent and take your hand off him. Allow us to conduct our investigation." It was an order, not a request, delivered to a woman old enough to be her grandmother with the icy authority of a drill sergeant. Eleanor flinched as if she'd been slapped. Her hand recoiled from Walter's arm, leaving a faint red mark on his skin. She sank back into her chair, her face a mask of stunned silence, her dignity stripped away by a woman young enough to be her granddaughter. They were being expertly separated, their unity broken, leaving each of them isolated in their own bubble of fear. With the couple now silenced and subdued, the male officer nodded curtly to his partner. "Check it," he commanded. The female officer gave a short, affirmative nod and turned, walking with purpose toward the Buick. The male officer remained where he was, a human wall between Walter and Eleanor and the violation that was about to occur. He crossed his arms over his chest, his stance a clear message. "You will stand here. You will watch, and you will do nothing." The sound of their car door being pulled open was a loud metallic groan in the now silent parking lot. It felt obscene. Walter watched, his heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm against his ribs, as the stranger in the uniform leaned into the private, familiar space of his car. Her blue uniform body brushed against the passenger seat where Eleanor had sat just minutes ago, her head and shoulders disappearing inside as she began her search. It was an intolerable intrusion. His car, his sanctuary, had been breached. He could feel its quiet dignity being violated from 20 feet away. The officer rummaged through the glove compartment first, the sound of papers being shuffled and tossed aside audible in the stillness. She found nothing. She moved to the space between the seats, her hands probing and searching. Then she picked up the small, black book resting on the passenger seat. It was Eleanor's hymnal, the one she carried to church every Sunday. Its cover was soft and worn with age, its spine held together with black tape Walter had carefully applied years ago. The officer held it in her hand for a moment, an artifact from a world she clearly did not understand or respect. With a dismissive flick of her thumb, she fanned through the delicate, paper-thin pages, scanning the titles of hymns that had been the soundtrack to their lives. Then, with a final gesture of contempt, she tossed it back onto the seat, where it landed with a soft, defeated thud. Eleanor made a small, wounded sound in the back of her throat. A single tear escaped from the corner of her eye and traced a slow, hot path down her cheek. This was worse than the accusation of theft. This was a defilement of something sacred, a calculated disregard for the very fabric of their faith and their life. The incident was no longer a brief, contained stop. It had become a scene. The few other patrons at the diner, who had initially tried to mind their own business, were now staring openly, their meals forgotten. A man walking his dog on the sidewalk across the street had stopped, his hand resting on the dog's head as he watched. A minivan with a family inside slowed as it passed the diner's entrance. The faces of children pressed against the rear windows. The world, which had been their private sanctuary, had transformed into a stage. Walter and Eleanor stood frozen, no longer just the subjects of a baseless investigation, but the unwilling stars of a roadside spectacle. Their personal, terrifying violation was now a public performance, and they were left with a new, searing layer of humiliation, exposed under the curious, pitying, and accusing gazes of strangers. The male officer, Rick, noticed the subtle shift in the diner's atmosphere. He saw the turning heads and the sudden interest from passers-by. The silent judgment of the small but growing crowd felt like a challenge to his authority. A quiet questioning of his control over the scene. His jaw tightened. The passive act of standing guard was no longer enough. He needed to reassert dominance, to make it clear who was in charge. His gaze snapped back to Walter, and the pretense of procedural calm vanished from his face, replaced by a raw, aggressive impatience. He pushed himself off the cruiser he'd been leaning against and closed the remaining distance to Walter in 2 quick, purposeful strides. Before Walter could react, the officer's hand shot out. It did not push or guide. It clamped down on Walter's upper arm, fingers digging into the soft flesh over his bicep with bruising force. With a single, powerful motion, he hauled the 75-year-old man from his chair and pulled him physically away from the table, away from his wife, stumbling towards the open door of the Buick. The suddenness and violence of the act stole Walter's breath. "You're going to tell me right now where you got this vehicle," the officer growled, his voice a low, guttural command right next to Walter's ear. The grip, the heat of the man's breath, the baseless accusation. The combination was a key turning a lock deep inside Walter, a lock he had spent a lifetime trying to rust shut. The bright, sun-bleached gravel of the parking lot dissolved. The smell of coffee vanished, replaced by the damp, loamy scent of a Mississippi night, thick with the drone of cicadas. The year was 1949. He was 19 years old, walking the dirt path home after spending the evening on Eleanor's porch, the ghost of her laughter still warming him. He was strong then, his body hardened by long days in the sun, but he was still just a boy. A different hand, attached to a different uniform, a county sheriff's deputy, had shot out of the darkness and clamped onto his arm in the very same way. The question had been different, but the poison was identical. "What's a boy like you doing out on this road so late? What are you up to?" The moonlight had glinted off the star-shaped badge, a cold silver eye that saw not a young man in love, but a suspect in search of a crime. The fear he'd felt then was a sharp, crystalline thing, a terror so pure it had vibrated through his entire body. He had been powerless, his word worth less than the dust on the deputy's boots. He had learned in that moment that his truth was a currency these men would not accept. Now, 56 years later, the same hand, on the same arm, asked the same question. The terror was still there, a ghost haunting the chambers of his heart. But now it was mixed with the bone-deep weariness of a man who had run the same race his entire life, only to find himself at the same starting line. The pain of the memory wasn't just in its sharpness, but in its infuriating, heartbreaking persistence. He was no longer a boy of 19, but a grandfather of 75, and still, he was being treated like one. The realization was a profound internal collapse. "Old you, officer," a voice was saying, and Walter realized with a jolt that it was his own. The female officer's sharp tone, coming from the direction of the car, had pulled him from the mire of the past. He was back in the too bright sun, the officer's grip still a band of fire on his arm. He was trying to pull away, a futile, desperate gesture. His own voice sounded thin and reedy to his ears, shaking with a volatile cocktail of ancient fear and fresh anger. "I told you, it's our car. We bought it. Brand new." Each word was a struggle, an attempt to claw his way back to the reality of his own life, a life they were trying to erase. His protest was cut short. The female officer had completed her search and was walking back toward them. She held a small, rectangular object between her thumb and forefinger, holding it away from her body as if it were a piece of contaminated evidence. Walter's heart seized. It was the photograph of their grandchildren he kept tucked in the glove compartment, a 4x6 print, its corners softened from handling, its colors slightly faded. On it, 7-year-old Maya and 5-year-old James were sitting on the steps of their porch, grinning gap-toothed, their arms thrown around each other, a single moment of pure, uncomplicated joy captured on film. The officer stopped in front of them, her eyes cold and clinical. She held up the photograph, angling it so her partner could see. Her voice was sharp, a surgeon's scalpel dissecting his story. "Then who are these people?" The question was so fundamentally absurd, so steeped in malice, that for a moment Walter could not process it. These people? They were his blood. They were the continuity of his life, the reason for his 50 years of hard work, the very heart of the future he and Eleanor had built together. Before he could form a reply, Eleanor spoke, her voice trembling but clear. "Those are our grandchildren." The officer's gaze shifted to Eleanor, a flicker of something like satisfaction in her eyes. She had found a new line of attack. She ignored Eleanor's answer, instead directing her next questions to Walter, her tone becoming a low, threatening purr. "And their parents? What are their names?" She paused, letting the question hang. "Do they live around here? I think we might need to give them a call, just to verify your story." That was it. That was the final turn of the screw. This was no longer about a car. It was about leverage. It was about terrorizing them by threatening to drag their family, their son, their daughter-in-law, their grandbabies into this nightmare. It was a clear, unambiguous threat designed to break them. Walter stood, mute and shaking, the officer's grip the only thing holding him upright. He looked at Eleanor. She was staring at the female officer, at the precious photograph being held hostage in her hand. And in that moment, Walter saw the last vestiges of hope die in his wife's eyes. He saw the full, terrible comprehension dawn on her face. This was not a traffic stop gone wrong. This was not a terrible misunderstanding. This was not even just the casual, everyday prejudice they had learned to navigate like treacherous waters. This was a deliberate, methodical, and personal act of cruelty. These officers were not upholding the law. They were enjoying its perversion. They were taking pleasure in their power, in their ability to inflict fear and humiliation on two old people on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Her face, which had been a canvas of fear and confusion, crumpled. The strength that had held her upright seemed to drain away. Her eyes, which had pleaded with Walter just moments before, now filled with tears. But these were not the hot tears of anger or the single, quiet tear of a desecrated faith. These were the slow, cold tears of absolute heartbreak. It was the weeping of a soul that had just been forced to look into the face of pure, senseless malice and recognize it for what it was. Her breath hitched in a soft, broken sob as she finally understood. This wasn't an investigation. It was a torment. Eleanor's quiet, broken sobs were the only sound Walter could hear, a sound that cut through his own haze of shock and rage more sharply than any command. He stood limp in the officer's grip, a prisoner on his own anniversary. The two officers seemed content to let the moment fester, to let the couple steep in their own humiliation. But the tableau of quiet cruelty was broken by a new sound, one that did not belong to their tightly controlled scene: the low, steady crunch of tires rolling slowly across the gravel lot. A dark, late-model SUV, its black paint absorbing the bright sunlight, glided into the lot with a quiet efficiency that spoke of power and precision. It parked neatly in a spot a short distance away. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, with shoulders that filled the frame of his uniform, a figure of immediate and unquestionable authority. It was the deep, midnight blue of the Marine Corps dress blues, the trousers creased to a razor's edge, the scarlet blood stripe a vivid slash of color. Polished brass buttons glinted on his tunic, and a rack of ribbons on his chest spoke a silent, colorful language of service and sacrifice. He placed a pristine white cover on his head, its brim casting a sharp, clean shadow over his eyes. It was their son, Gunnery Sergeant Michael Peterson. He had been driving with a light heart, a rare, easy smile on his face. The 30-mile trip was filled with pleasant anticipation. The thought of the surprise he had planned warming him. He imagined the look on his mother's face when he walked up to their table, the booming laugh his father would let out before pulling him into a rough embrace. But as he pulled into the diner's parking lot, the easy joy in his chest began to cool. He saw the police cruiser first, parked at an aggressive, proprietary angle behind his parents' familiar Buick. He saw the two officers, and then he saw them. His focus narrowed, and the warmth inside him turned instantly to a block of ice. He saw his mother, her shoulders shaking with sobs, her face buried in her hands. He saw his father, standing ramrod straight but looking smaller and more fragile than Michael had ever seen him, a uniformed man's hand clamped firmly on his arm. He saw the condescending smirk on one officer's face and the cold indifference on the others. He saw the small, watching crowd. He took it all in a single, sickening second, and the world shifted on its axis. On the passenger seat of his SUV, a small, beautifully wrapped gift lay waiting. It was a sterling silver picture frame, antique and elegant, and inside it, he'd placed the restored photograph from his parents' wedding day 50 years ago. It was a symbol of their enduring love, a testament to the life they had built. As his mind processed the scene of their degradation, his right hand, which had been resting on the steering wheel, clenched into a tight, white-knuckled fist. The gift, with all its love and history, was utterly forgotten, its gentle sentiment obliterated by the raw, ugly reality before him. The ice in his veins was followed by a surge of heat. It was not the wild, explosive rage of his youth. This was something different, something colder and far more dangerous. It was a protective fire, a focused, controlled fury that had been forged in the discipline of the Corps and fueled by a lifetime of love for the two people being tormented before him. It was the righteous anger of a son whose sole purpose in that moment was to shield his family. He felt his training kick in, his emotions locking into a cold, clear resolve. He shut the door of the SUV. The sound was not a slam, but a solid, definitive thud that cut through the parking lot, drawing the eyes of the officers. He didn't run or even hurry. He began to stride toward them, his movements economical and purposeful, his back ramrod straight. Each step on the gravel was measured and deliberate, the sound a steady, relentless rhythm that announced his approach. His eyes, cold and hard as chips of flint, were locked on the hand gripping his father's arm. He saw nothing else. He was a weapon, and he had found his target. He came to a halt a few feet from the group, deliberately positioning his body in the space between the officers and his parents. A living shield of midnight blue and scarlet. The air, already thick with tension, seemed to suck inward, crackling with a new and volatile energy. His presence, so disciplined and immaculate, was a stark, jarring contrast to the messy, cruel spectacle the officers had created. He stood there in absolute stillness, his imposing frame radiating a power that was nothing like the officer's thuggish authority. It was the earned power of integrity and control. The scene froze, locked on his silent, imposing presence and the hard, unforgiving line of his jaw, just before he opened his mouth to speak. The sudden arrival of this immaculate, imposing figure had a visible effect on the two officers. The male officer, Rick, blinked, his aggressive focus on Walter momentarily broken. His grip on the old man's arm loosened almost imperceptibly, a subconscious reaction to the appearance of a new, unexpected variable that did not fit his narrative. The female officer's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing as she performed a quick, cold assessment of the newcomer, from his polished shoes to the sharp crease of his cover. For a long moment, the only sound was the rustle of leaves in the oak tree. Then, breaking the tense silence, the Marine spoke. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a calm, resonant authority that cut through the charged atmosphere and commanded immediate attention. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being heard, a man for whom command was as natural as breathing. Officers, he addressed them directly, his gaze steady and unwavering. He then gave a slight, formal nod towards his parents, who were staring at him with a mixture of shock and dawning hope. I am Marine Gunnery Sergeant Michael Peterson. These are my parents. The statement was simple, a declaration of fact that was also an undeniable claim of protection. He then squared his shoulders, a subtle, almost imperceptible adjustment that nonetheless seemed to make him fill the space even more completely. His eyes settled on Rick, and he posed a question that was wrapped in courtesy but delivered with the force of a demand. Can you please explain what's going on here? The direct address, combined with the unexpected authority of the uniform and rank, visibly flustered Rick. The aggressive certainty he had displayed moments before evaporated, replaced by a sudden, jarring uncertainty. His grip on Walter's arm, which he hadn't even realized he was still maintaining, fell away completely. Walter stumbled a half step, freed, rubbing at the angry red mark on his bicep. Rick's eyes darted from Michael's face to the ribbons on his chest and back again, as if trying to calculate a new, unforeseen power dynamic. Sir, he began, his voice losing its earlier gruffness, a slight stammer betraying his unease. We're just conducting a routine investigation. He defaulted to the shield of procedural language, his only remaining defense. He gestured vaguely toward the Buick. The license plate on this vehicle doesn't match the vehicle description in our system. We have to check these things out. He said it as if this single, dry fact could explain the tears on Eleanor's face and the red mark on Walter's arm. Michael listened patiently, his expression unchanging. When the officer finished, he gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if giving the flimsy excuse fair and due consideration. The gesture made his rebuttal all the more devastating. I'm familiar with routine, officer, he said, his voice still calm, but now with an edge as sharp as the crease on his trousers. I'm also familiar with protocol. I've spent 20 years of my life executing and enforcing it. He let that statement settle in the air for a beat. And protocol doesn't usually involve this kind of public spectacle. He tilted his head slightly, a subtle gesture that encompassed the other diner patrons who were now openly watching, and the small crowd gathering near the roadside. Can you explain why your routine requires an audience? Rick opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was completely wrong-footed, unprepared for his own terminology to be dissected with such precision. Before he could formulate an answer, Michael pressed his advantage. His eyes, which had been fixed on the officer's face, flicked down for a fraction of a second to the spot where Rick's hand had been gripping his father's arm. Then they snapped back up, and his voice dropped, losing its detached, professional calm and taking on a harder, more personal tone. And does routine protocol involve putting your hands on a senior citizen who is cooperating? Is that part of the procedure you were following? The question was a direct hit, and Rick flinched. The female officer, seeing her partner flounder, stepped forward, attempting to regain control. "Sir, the discrepancy was flagged. We were just—" Michael cut her off, not by raising his voice, but by simply turning his unwavering attention to her. "A discrepancy," he repeated, tasting the word. He then turned his gaze back to Rick. "With all due respect, officers," he said, the military courtesy now sounding like a blade. "This is their car. They have owned it for decades, since before you were likely born. I find it incredibly hard to believe that a simple clerical error in your system warrants this level of aggressive scrutiny." He paused, letting the logic of his statement expose the absurdity of their actions. He then pivoted from the procedural to the human cost, his voice softening with a carefully controlled emotion that was more powerful than any shout. "Are you aware of the distress you are causing my parents? Do you see my mother's tears? They are elderly citizens of this community, and your routine investigation is completely and utterly unnecessary." He let the word unnecessary hang in the air, a final judgment on their conduct. The officers were now visibly on the defensive, their entire justification dismantled piece by piece. They looked at each other, a silent, panicked exchange passing between them. They had lost control, and they knew it. Michael saw their faltering confidence and took one small, deliberate step forward, mirroring Rick's earlier, aggressive move. But where the officer's advance had been an act of thuggish intimidation, Michael's was one of absolute, controlled power. He was no longer deconstructing their excuses. He was now going for the foundation. "This isn't just about a license plate. Is it, officers?" he asked, his voice low, intense, and carrying to every silent watcher. It was a question that demanded no answer, for everyone present already knew it. "This is about what you saw when you first pulled into this parking lot. It's about the assumptions you made the second you saw an elderly black couple sitting beside a classic car that you decided they had no right to own." He looked from Rick's now pale face to the female officer's rigid expression. "This is about how you chose to approach them, not with courtesy, not with respect, but with immediate suspicion and hostility." His voice, though still controlled, resonated with the righteous, undeniable fury of a son who had just witnessed his parents being violated. "This is about your choice to humiliate them, to intimidate them, and to treat them like criminals for the crime of enjoying a peaceful Sunday afternoon." He let his words sink in, a damning indictment delivered in the bright, unforgiving sunlight. "This is about blatant, inexcusable disrespect." His final accusation landed in the superheated silence. There was nothing left to say. He had not raised his voice, had not uttered a single curse, but he had systematically stripped them of their authority, their justifications, and their dignity, leaving them exposed and speechless. They were left with no procedures to hide behind, no excuses to offer, forced to confront the ugly truth of their actions under the unwavering, judging gaze of a gunnery sergeant of the United States Marine Corps. Rick and his partner stood frozen in the deafening silence that followed Michael's indictment. Their faces were a mixture of shock, anger, and dawning panic. They looked for a defense, a procedural loophole, a retort, but found nothing. Their authority had been so thoroughly dismantled, their motives so cleanly exposed, that there was no ground left for them to stand on. Their silence was a confession. Michael watched them for a long, hard moment, his gaze unwavering, and saw in their stunned inaction that there would be no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. He realized then that speaking to them further was pointless. They were a lost cause. So, he turned. With a precise military pivot on his heel, he shifted his body to face the small, watching crowd. He took a half step towards them, opening his posture, consciously breaking the tight, confrontational circle he had formed with the officers and his parents. He was no longer just a son defending his family. He was now a citizen addressing his community. He raised his voice, not to a shout, but to a clear, resonant pitch designed to carry across the parking lot, to reach every single person who was bearing witness. "My parents," he began, his voice ringing with a conviction that was impossible to ignore. "Are Walter and Eleanor Peterson?" He spoke their names with reverence, reclaiming them from the anonymous status of suspects. He gestured with an open hand toward them, where Walter now stood free, and Eleanor was slowly, shakily getting to her feet. "They have lived in this town their entire lives. They raised me in this town. They have worked hard, paid their taxes, and contributed to this community for over 50 years. They have been members of the First Baptist Church on Elm Street for as long as I can remember. They are good, honest, law-abiding people." He let his words paint a picture for the onlookers, a portrait of dignity and integrity that stood in a stark, brutal contrast to the scene of harassment they were witnessing. "They are pillars of this community. They have earned their peace. They have earned their rest." His voice grew stronger, imbued with the full force of his righteous anger. "And they have most certainly earned the right to enjoy a quiet Sunday afternoon, celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary without being treated like criminals, without being manhandled, and without being subjected to this kind of humiliating harassment." Having made his case to the court of public opinion, he slowly turned his head, fixing the two officers with a cold, piercing stare. The weight of every eye in the parking lot followed his, zeroing in on the two uniformed figures who now seemed to shrink under the collective gaze. Michael's voice dropped back to a low, firm, commanding tone. "I demand," he said, each word a precisely cut stone, "that you apologize to my parents for the way you have treated them." The demand hung in the air, absolute and unequivocal. He wasn't finished. "And I expect you to conduct yourselves with professionalism and respect from this moment forward. You are public servants. It's time you remembered what that means." The silence that followed was different. It was no longer just the absence of noise. It was heavy and thick with judgment. The crowd, which had been a scattered collection of curious, hesitant onlookers, now felt like a single, unified entity. They had been galvanized by Michael's words, their passive observation transformed into active, moral outrage. They were no longer just watching a scene. They were bearing witness to an injustice, and their silent support for the Peterson family was a palpable force. Then, the silence was broken. A low mutter came from an older man in a fishing cap standing near the diner's entrance. He shook his head slowly, his voice raspy with disgust. "Same old story," he said to his wife, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Just shameful." Near the edge of the lot, a young woman who had been watching with a horrified expression turned to her friend. "Did you hear him?" she whispered, her voice sharp with disbelief. "He said it was a clerical error. You don't do all this for a clerical error." The flimsy pretext, now exposed, sounded even more ridiculous when repeated. The screen door of the diner creaked open, and the owner, a large, heavy-set man with flour dusting the front of his white apron, stepped out onto the porch. He wiped his hands on a rag tucked into his belt, his face a mask of profound disapproval. He didn't say a word. He simply looked directly at Rick, held his gaze for a long, damning moment, and then gave a single, slow, deliberate shake of his head. It was a silent, powerful verdict from the community itself. He then turned, went back inside, and let the screen door slap shut behind him. The officers were now completely isolated, trapped in a circle of public condemnation. It was then that a young man standing near the front of the crowd made a decision. He lifted his smartphone, his movements quick and certain. His thumb tapped the screen, and the small, ruby-red light of a recording began to glow. He held the phone up, steady and unwavering, openly and unapologetically documenting the officer's disgrace, transforming a fleeting moment of injustice into a permanent, shareable record. As if cued by this act of digital defiance, an elderly woman with kind, compassionate eyes stepped forward from the group. She walked with a quiet grace, bypassing the officers as if they were nothing more than inconvenient statues. She went directly to Eleanor, whose hands were trembling by her sides. The woman reached out and gently placed a warm hand on Eleanor's arm. Not the bruising grip of the officer, but a soft, steady touch of comfort and solidarity. "It's all right, dear," she murmured, her voice a gentle balm. "It's all right. We're all right here." The officers now stood utterly defeated. They were no longer facing just a defiant Marine and his elderly parents. They were facing the quiet, damning judgment of an entire community, a community that had just chosen its side. The sight of the recording phone was a tipping point. Rick's eyes locked onto the small, glowing red light, and a new kind of fear, cold, professional, and sharp, eclipsed his anger. This was no longer just a confrontation that would end when he drove away. It was now evidence. It was a permanent record that could be sent, shared, and scrutinized by supervisors, internal affairs, and lawyers. His confidence, already in tatters, completely vanished. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a nervous, uncomfortable movement. He suddenly felt hot and exposed in his uniform, acutely aware of every watching eye, each one feeling like a tiny, burning indictment. The entire situation had spiraled out of his control, and he was now trapped in the center of it. His partner felt the shift, too. Her cold, professional demeanor finally cracked under the pressure of the silent, judging crowd and the undeniable evidence of the phone. Her gaze darted from the phone to Michael's unyielding face, then to her partner's obvious panic. She realized their position was no longer just difficult, it was indefensible. Taking a half step closer to Rick, she turned her body slightly, attempting to shield her words from the onlookers. "Rick," she whispered, her voice a tense, urgent hiss. "Just run the VIN again. Find an excuse. Let's just go." Her priority had changed completely. It was no longer about asserting authority or proving a point. It was about damage control. It was about escape. "This isn't worth it." Her panicked whisper seemed to jolt Rick into action, but it was the flailing action of a drowning man. He saw only one path left, to retreat behind the shield of procedure, his last and most flimsy defense. He puffed up his chest in a transparent, almost comical attempt to reclaim some semblance of his lost authority. He squared his shoulders, deliberately avoiding Michael's eyes and instead directing his words to a point somewhere over his left shoulder. "Sir," he began, the phrase, with all due respect, now sounding utterly absurd, a hollow echo of a courtesy he had never possessed. "You have to understand, we get a flag from dispatch. We have to follow the flag. It's protocol." He was speaking faster now, the words tumbling out in a rush to build a wall of jargon around himself. "We don't make the flags, we just respond to them. The information on the plate was incorrect. We have a duty to investigate that. It's a matter of officer safety." He had finally offered his ultimate justification. Officer safety. The two most powerful words in his arsenal, designed to shut down any argument, to justify any action. He said them as if they were a magic incantation that could erase the last 10 minutes of cruelty and incompetence. Michael listened to the pathetic, jargon-filled excuse without a single change in his expression. When Rick finally finished, the silence that followed was more damning than any response. Michael let the excuse hang in the air for a long moment, allowing its weakness and absurdity to be felt by everyone present. Then, he gave a slight, almost pitying shake of his head. "Officer safety?" Michael repeated, his voice quiet but dripping with incredulity. He gestured with his chin towards his parents. Eleanor was being quietly comforted by the elderly woman, and Walter was simply watching, his face a mask of weary sorrow. "My unarmed 75-year-old father and my 72-year-old mother were a threat to your safety?" He let the question expose the ludicrousness of Rick's claim. He took a step closer, and his voice became hard as granite. "Your system and your flags do not give you a license to violate their rights. They do not give you a license to put your hands on my father or to command my mother to be silent. They do not give you a license to treat them with contempt." He looked directly into Rick's eyes, pinning him with his gaze. "You had a dozen different ways you could have handled a clerical error. You could have been courteous. You could have been respectful. You could have been professional. You chose not to be." He paused, letting the weight of his final judgment settle. You made a choice. You chose to see them as suspects. You chose to treat them this way. Don't you dare hide behind a procedure to justify your own prejudice. And with that, there was nothing left. Michael's unwavering stance and his simple, powerful truths had systematically demolished every pillar of their authority. The flimsy shield of protocol was shattered. The excuse of officer safety was rendered laughable. They were left standing in a bubble of profound, humiliating silence, stripped of all power, all justification, all respect. Rick's face was flushed a deep, mottled red, a mixture of impotent rage and burning shame. His partner looked down at the gravel, unable to meet anyone's gaze. They had been so confident in their power just a short time ago, so certain of their ability to control and intimidate. Now, they were just two people, exposed and defeated, forced to confront the ugly consequences of their discriminatory behavior with no place left to hide. The silence that descended was absolute and excruciating. It pressed down on the two officers, heavy with the weight of their failure and the unwavering judgment of the crowd. Every second that ticked by amplified their humiliation. There was nowhere to look, nothing to say. Rick's face burned, and he could feel the sweat trickling down his back. The need to end this unbearable stalemate, to say something that would allow them to finally turn and walk away, became an overwhelming physical imperative. It would not be an apology born of remorse, but of a desperate need for escape. He cleared his throat, the sound loud and rough in the stillness. He directed his words to the gravel at his feet, unable to meet the eyes of Michael or his parents. "Sir, ma'am," he mumbled, the words thick and grudging. We apologize if we caused you any inconvenience." His partner quickly chimed in, her voice equally insincere and defensive. "We have to be thorough when a plate is flagged. It's a matter of public safety." Their words were hollow, a transparent attempt to perform the bare minimum social ritual required to exit the scene. They were apologizing for the inconvenience, not for the terror, the humiliation, or the blatant prejudice. Michael looked at them with an expression of cold contempt. He had not demanded an apology for his own sake, but for his parents. And this pathetic, self-serving excuse was an even deeper insult than their earlier silence. "Those words ring hollow. Officers," he said, his voice quiet but final. "An apology without acknowledging the harm you caused is just empty air." He held their gaze for a moment longer, posing a final, unanswerable question. "Do you understand the fear you inflicted on my parents? Do you recognize the foundation of your actions?" He didn't wait for a response he knew would never come. He simply turned his back on them, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. With no escape hatch left, defeated and profoundly humiliated, the two officers retreated. They turned without another word, their shoulders slumped, their movements stiff and graceless. They walked back to their cruiser, the eyes of the crowd following them every step of the way. The car doors, which had been thrown open with such aggressive confidence, were now shut with a soft, defeated thud. The engine turned over, and the cruiser pulled out of the gravel lot. Its exit, as shamefaced as its arrival, had been arrogant. It drove away, leaving behind a lingering sense of unease and the bitter taste of injustice in the warm afternoon air. The moment the cruiser disappeared from view, the tension that had held Eleanor upright finally broke. She let out a soft, shuddering sob and collapsed against her son, burying her face in the crisp, dark blue fabric of his uniform. Michael's arms went around her instantly, holding her tightly. His own eyes squeezed shut for a moment as he absorbed her trembling. "I've got you, Mom," he whispered into her hair. "I'm here. I've got you." Walter stepped forward, his face etched with 1,000 emotions, and placed a large, gentle hand on his son's broad back. A silent trinity of family holding each other together in the aftermath. As they stood there, a sound began to ripple through the parking lot. It started with one person, then another, and then grew into a warm, supportive wave of applause. It wasn't a loud, boisterous cheer, but a heartfelt expression of relief, solidarity, and respect. The onlookers, no longer silent, began to close the distance, not to intrude, but to offer comfort. "God bless you, son," a man said, his voice thick with emotion. "We are so sorry you had to go through that." Another woman added, her hand on her heart. Their words were a balm, a communal embrace that began to soothe the raw, open wound of the encounter. After a long moment, Eleanor's sobs subsided, and Michael gently eased his embrace. He kept one protective arm around his mother's shoulders and turned to his father. Walter looked at him, his eyes shining with unshed tears, and managed a weak, shaky smile. His voice was a low, hoarse whisper, thick with a complex mixture of pride and sorrow. "You didn't have to. You shouldn't have had to do that, son." The words were a thank you and a lament all in one, gratitude for the man his son had become, and a profound, heartbreaking sorrow that in this world, his son still had to fight these same old battles on their behalf. Just then, the diner owner bustled out, a clean white tray balanced expertly in his hands. On it sat 2 steaming mugs of coffee and 2 generous slices of apple pie, their crusts golden and flaky. He navigated through the remaining well-wishers with a gentle smile and placed the tray on the table where Walter and Eleanor had been sitting what felt like a lifetime ago. "This is on the house," he said, his voice full of a simple, genuine compassion that felt more healing than any apology. He met Walter's eyes. "You folks deserve a little peace and quiet after all that." The crowd, sensing the family needed space, began to disperse, offering final nods and kind smiles as they went. Michael gently guided his parents back to the table and helped them into their chairs. For a moment, they just sat there, the comforting aroma of coffee and cinnamon filling the air around them. The world began to feel real again. Eleanor looked across the small table at her husband. She reached out, her small, trembling hand covering his larger, calloused one where it rested on the wood. His fingers instinctively intertwined with hers, a familiar, grounding pressure. She looked at his hands, then into his eyes, which still held the shadow of the afternoon's ordeal. Her voice, when she spoke, was a soft, steady whisper, a secret meant only for him, a thread tying the end of the day back to its beautiful beginning. "The sunflowers are still beautiful, Wally."